and you don't pay attention to the international situation, you can be overwhelmed by it before you know it. Now tonight on the 6 o'clock news, Obama came on, President Obama. And he made a 3-minute talk. They probably told him, you get out there or else, because he's been accused of being kind of passive in the crisis situation. So he came on the stage and he warned Russia against any kind of untoward developments, and he said there'll be consequences. He was very modest in his tone, but he was firm in this thing about the consequences. Now, after he spoke, Wolf Blitzer, I don't know if anybody knows him, he's a mouthpiece for the Pentagon. He used to work at the Pentagon, actually, and he works for CNN. And he gave over maybe 10 minutes of his program to John McCain. And then came on Wesley Clark, who was the former commander of NATO, who orchestrated the destruction of Yugoslavia. And he came on after McCain. And what I noticed, both of them said, Putin wants to reestablish the Soviet Empire. See?
Go ahead, do it.
Now, in the article that I wrote, I quoted Hillary Clinton in the year 2012, when she was at a human rights conference in Dublin, and she said the same thing. She said, well, you can call it a customs union, you can call it a Eurasian Union, but whatever you call it, they want to reestablish the Soviet Empire. Now, Hillary Clinton was an ally of McCain. If you remember, she went to Afghanistan with McCain. She was the right-wing hawk of the first Obama administration. So what does these people speak for the most aggressive elements within the Pentagon? So we as a party have to take this into consideration. Now the discussion is that the Russians are sending troops to the Crimea. I don't know if everybody knows what the Crimea is or what its background is. Well, maybe I could. Just for, okay, you point. Okay, John, thank you, John. It's a peninsula which used to be part of the USSR. It was a republic within the USSR. It had a definite constitutional part, was a definite constitutional part of the USSR, like all the other republics. And for reasons that are variously controversial and are not necessary for us to go into, in 1954, Khrushchev, the head of the USSR, the premier, transferred the Crimean Peninsula from the Soviet Union, Russia, the Russian Republic, to the Ukrainian Republic. But on that island, on that peninsula rather, there's the Soviet base at Sevastopol, a huge base, their navy. It's their big naval installation in the Black Sea. Now you put yourself in the position of the military in Russia or Putin, and you see that the US imperialists, together with the EU, have just grabbed the Ukraine. They grabbed the Ukraine. They haven't got it all together, but they have the commanding heights. They have Kiev, they have Lviv, they have the West, and they have a puppet government that dances to their tune. And it's totally dependent upon them. Now I'll use the pointer. You see that they are trying to grab the Ukraine, but let's see what came before that. If you are sitting in Moscow, I want to just point out the NATO expansion that has taken place, moving towards the borders of Russia. My comrade John Catalinato drew these brown lines to show where the old NATO was. The brown lines over here are the old NATO. After 1991 and the collapse of the USSR, this is the new NATO. All the way up Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, the Czech Republic, Romania, Bulgaria. Without Croatia, they don't really have much to offer to the struggle. But this is what's been going on for the last 20 years. Advancing toward the Russian border with the military organization. I'm not talking about an economic organization. With the military organization of imperialism. And then, after all this, boom, they try to grab this very, very important country of 45 million people, a rich agricultural base, the richest in the area, maybe in all of Europe, the black soil of the West. A very strong and powerful industrial establishment, a scientific establishment, and the West wants to gobble it up and go right into the heart of Russia, really. The Ukraine has been associated with Russia for a long time. Unfortunately, until the Soviet Union, it was relations of oppression. But once the Soviet Union was formed, the Ukraine was liberated. And the Ukrainian language, which had been outlawed under the Tsar and the various rulers, Poland, the Austrians, was elevated in the Ukraine under the USSR. The culture of the Ukrainians was revived and promoted. And now the West wants to take it back and integrate it within the framework of imperialism. When you heard Wesley Clark, and you heard McCain, and you hear Clinton, you get the feeling that this crisis, as they see it, is a way for a big comeback for the Pentagon. They're red baiting. They want to terrify everybody and scare everybody when the Pentagon is being cut back and its role is being questioned in the world. They see that they're salivating over this. Now, a couple of words about how this happened. Why is it? What precipitated this crisis? The Yanukovych government in the Ukraine Whatever its defects and faults, and there must be tons of them, tons of them, following what he perceived to be the national interest of the Ukraine, was confronted with a choice because the economic situation in the Ukraine is serious. Their foreign reserves are diminishing. The economic situation is awful. It's a bourgeois regime. There's unemployment. There's all kinds of problems for the workers. And Yanukovych is part of the problem. But the European Union, the EU, headed by Germany, Merkel, France is power in it too, they set up a meeting for the European Union and they invited the republics, the former republics. They invited Belarus, they invited Ukraine, they invited Armenia, which is not on the map, and one other, and Georgia, and Moldova. So this is in November. And they try to force the Ukraine to sign up with an association with the EU. What were they going to give them? Nothing. They were going to give them a few, I don't know, some paltry amount of money. I can't remember how much it is. I think it's maybe at the most $1 billion or a couple of billion. But they were going to also ask them to cut the subsidies for gas that they have in the Ukraine. They were going to ask them to devalue their currency and so on and so forth for the privilege of having trade relations with the EU. On the other side, the Russians came in, Putin came in, and said, well, we've been nasty to you in the past at many times, but right now, and they have, they choked off their gas for a while. Right now, we were willing to give a $15 billion loan. We're willing to reduce our gas price to you, and they give them over half the gas to the Ukraine. Hundreds of billions of cubic feet per year, which, you know, for an industrial country like that, this is very important. We will cut it by 1/3, the price of gas, and we'll give you favorable trade relations, trade agreements, you know, tariff reductions or even elimination of tariffs. That's a no-brainer, really, for somebody who's a president of a country and is trying to at least sustain it. That's when this started, in November, when he declined that and signed the agreement with the Russians for aid. And the Western imperialists went wild. And before you know it, there were demonstrations on the streets of Kiev demanding, we want to be with Europe, 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 Europe. It became like a mantra over and over. For 3 months, these demonstrations went on. And they built up and they built up. Especially during the Olympics, they made sure to bring this crescendo up just at the height of the Olympics. Timing is everything in politics, you know. So, these demonstrations were battering the government. And in the parliament, there were these parties. There was the Svoboda, the Freedom Party, which is semi-fascist, not fully, semi. The real fully were out in the streets, the right front, of which the Svoboda Party was part of it. The Fatherland Party, which is the party of the current Prime Minister and President. And the party for the German, it is the German party, but it's the UDOC party with the boxer Klitschko, the big 6 foot something or other, is the champion. And he is Merkel's person in Ukraine. And his party is the German party in the Ukraine. So they sat down during this crisis, not the Civil Voter Party, they weren't part of it. The French foreign minister, the German foreign minister, and the Polish foreign minister. Just a few days before Yanukovych had to leave the country. And they sat down with Yanukovych and his people, and they came up with an agreement, which was very, very bad. But it was an agreement. It was to have a constitutional change, reducing the powers of the presidency. Yanukovych was the president, elevating the parliament. It was to let a person by the name of Tymoshenko out of jail, who had led a similar reactionary movement for the EU in 2004, called the Orange Revolution. She got put in jail by Yanukovych, that's another story. But she was in there. So part of the agreement was to let her out. She's pro-EU. There were other parts of the agreement that escape me right now, but those are two very important ones. And the third one, though, was to call early presidential elections. The elections were scheduled for 2015 at the end, December. They moved it up to 2014, December. They spent 30 hours, the European foreign ministers and Yanukovych, negotiating this. It was an all-nighter. They were trying to find a way to ease in, to set up conditions politically and legally that could ease them in a pro-EU government. And they were this close. Now, I want to call your attention. All right, I'll come back to that. They were this close, but they were on a different page from U.S. imperialism. The U.S. imperialism was okay with them going over to the EU. That's okay. Because the U.S. imperialists they dominate the IMF, and the EU was going to bring the IMF in to underwrite the loans and get their pound of flesh. So the U.S. had an economic way in without the EU. But they were more interested in geopolitical, geostrategic advantage against Russia. That's what they were about. So after the EU ministers stayed up 30 hours and negotiated this soft agreement, what happened? There was all this maneuvering in the parliament. They called a session when 100 members of Yanukovych's party weren't even there. They didn't tell him about the session. And his party, they're in the East for the most part. They probably were back home. They weren't there. And they passed a whole number of laws. But one of the things they did was to pass a ruling pulling the police off the street and saying that the army could not intervene and that nobody had the authority to do that. Meanwhile, outside the parliament and all the government buildings are thousands of fascist or semi-fascist right-wing armed people ready to take the whole thing over. That's the U.S. They tore up the EU agreement like a piece of paper and threw it in the garbage, got their stooges in parliament to have an illegal ruling to pull the police out so these fascist elements could intimidate and terrorize the government, the Yanukovych government, and threaten them physically. That was the end of the day. That was it. The so-called soft approach of the EU and Merkel and the Germans was in the wastebasket, and the right wing was in the saddle. Now, let's recall that famous conversation that was tape recorded between the Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, and the U.S. Ambassador to the Ukraine. What's his name?
Yeah.
Piat. That's the name of the U.S. Ambassador to the Ukraine. A few days before this. And they're sitting there talking about how they're going to maneuver the government in their direction. That's the famous F the EU. Remember F the EU? That's important that she said it that way. It says something about U.S. imperialism and its character. Most of all, it tells you their adventurous arrogance. Their adventurous arrogance was reflected in that epithet. But that's not what the part we need to pay attention to. What did she say? They're discussing the different possibilities. Klitschko. Nuland says, no, he's no good, not experienced. That's the German part. What about this Svoboda? His name is Tannenbach. The head of the Tannenbach is the head of this Svoboda party, semi-fascist. She said, no, they got a big party, the Svoboda party. It's the fourth largest party in Ukraine. He's not good for this. No. I like yachts. He'll do good. Now, when all the smoke cleared, and he's from the Fatherland Party, who's the president? The acting president. Yats is the acting president. Who's the prime minister? A guy named Turchinov. He's in the Fatherland Party. He's the deputy to Yats. And who got out of jail? Timoshenko, who's a leader of the Fatherland Party. That's the U.S. party. Not completely. The Germans have some input. But that's what they wanted. And these are the people who pulled the police. So the U.S. hands and fingerprints are all over this, really what amounts to a fascist assault, which was used as a shock troops to get their way politically. But mind you, half of these fascists in the street, they're against the EU too, from the right. They're not for the EU. But they're so fascist, they want to destroy the Yanukovych government, and probably half of them want to destroy the government that's inside there already. But they were used as shock troops to drive Yanukovych out of office. Now you can debate. Oh yeah, the map. Okay. You can debate whether Yanukovych did the right thing. A lot of people, maybe in Moscow, think he should have stood his ground and not run away and left the enemy free rein. But you don't know the circumstances, and we're not going to judge that. He's a bourgeois politician. He's always been a centrist. 1 month he's with the EU, and the next month he's with Russia. He's gone back and forth over time. And he also, just to get the record straight, he sent troops to Iraq when Bush called for the coalition of the willing. It's not like he's some progressive force at all. But that was the legally elected government. And U.S. overthrew them unceremoniously by force using fascist shock troops. That's what we have to know about. And that's the adventurous nature of U.S. imperialism. See, John pointed out to me that there's the map of Ukraine. This, just so you can see, all the gas for 1/3 of Europe and for the Ukraine comes in through gas lines that come right in here, right down here. Some go to Kiev, some go to Kharkov, some go elsewhere, but the main ones come all the way down here, go to Hungary, Slovenia, Poland. Russia supplies the gas. This whole area is the black soil area. This is the industrial East. This is a very important country. There is the Crimean Peninsula. This is Sebastopol. That's where the Russian Navy is. And it's not just ships, it's troops too. It's hardware, it's armored personnel carriers. How is Russia going to let this right-wing government hand us over to imperialism? Or in any way inhibit their presence in the Crimea? No. Now we as a party and all revolutionaries have to take this deadly serious. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't want to sound alarmist, and we don't want to sound the alarm either. But we want to be ready for any eventuality or else. They say Russians are sending troops to Crimea. The Crimeans were occupied by the Nazis for a year. They suffered and they fought and they died over there by the tens and hundreds of thousands fighting the Nazis in the Crimea. Just the way in the west of Ukraine, they're not all fascists and they weren't always all fascists. But the fascists have the political upper hand. In January, there was a demonstration of 15,000 people in Kiev for a fascist collaborator with the Nazis by the name of Bandera, who executed Poles and Jews. He was put in jail by the Nazis, but in jail he collaborated with them, and then they let him out to help train Nazi battalions in 1944. There was a demonstration for him of 15,000 in Kiev in January of this year, not in 1944. And he fought the Soviets until 1950 when he was beaten. His organization, not him personally. So there's an atmosphere over there. There's an atmosphere. And everybody who's got communist blood or working class blood or progressive blood in their arteries is worried about this. I don't say they want the Russians to come in. Maybe not. Probably not. Probably not. And actually, the truth is, they have to do this themselves. They got to do this themselves, the workers of Ukraine. And there's 115,000 members of the Communist Party in Ukraine, according to John. That's no small number. They have to do it themselves. But the Crimea is a special case. As I told you in the beginning of this meeting, it was Russia. And now what they're saying, what my information is, that the Crimeans are saying, we want a referendum on autonomy within the Ukraine. But autonomy, meaning even up to and including foreign policy. But autonomy within the Ukraine. Probably that means they'll pay their taxes to the Ukraine, they'll participate in Ukrainian society, but they want to protect themselves against a counter-revolutionary development in the Crimea. Some of them probably want to go back to Russia and be put back under Russia for understandable reasons. So I'm going to wrap up by saying this much. Whatever happens, people tend to think of the situation in terms of the Soviet Union and say Hungary or Czechoslovakia or whatever. And that's proper. That's a natural reflex and a natural instinct. But this is a different era. It's not. However, the Ukraine, for the US and the West to grab the Ukraine is a great danger to Russia and to humanity. And should they intervene in whatever way, that may not be the best thing. But if the US imperialists go in, we have to be against it. And we have to explain to the workers and the oppressed in the United States why whatever Russia does, it may be, we may not agree with it. But it was provoked by the intervention and the adventurism of US imperialism. It was provoked. This is a provocation to go in and snatch the Ukraine, to come to the border of Russia, and so the next thing you know, they're going to want to put Ukraine in NATO. See, so it's a serious threat. And we, as revolutionaries, have to be prepared for any kind of crisis that should develop and have a correct orientation. This is my suggestion. We haven't discussed it, and we should discuss it and refine it and iron it out. But the greater danger to humanity is for US imperialism to expand its empire and strengthen itself against the oppressed of the world, including right here at home. And that's what would happen. And anything that can stand in its way, well, so be it. So be it. But we can't be subjective. We don't like Putin. We don't like the counter-revolutionary government over there that came up on the bones of the Soviet socialist economy by dismantling it. We cannot be subjective in this. We have to consider what are the interests of the proletariat and the oppressed overall in this situation, and how to take sides, and how to conduct an independent struggle to prevent US imperialism from getting its way over there. I finish up on this. If it doesn't come to war, if it comes to a cold takeover, the Europeans haven't got a nickel in their pocket. They're busy bailing out Greece. They're busy bailing out Portugal. They're busy bailing out Italy. They're busy bailing out Spain. They're going to give $30 billion to the Ukraine? I don't think so. How are they going to tell that to the workers in Portugal or in Greece? Oh, well, we couldn't help you too much, but we got $30 billion for the counter-revolutionaries in the Ukraine. It's politically dangerous for them to try to do this. They're all talking numbers. Let's see the money on the table. And then the workers in the Ukraine will know what the hell really happened. And then, maybe then, they will be able to strike back and throw all these rascals out of the office and take over and restore the Ukrainian Socialist Republic. The Ukraine question is different from the question of Syria or Libya or the other things. See, the reason those questions are so hard in the movement is because the movement is backward. That's why. Any Leninist knows right away when a big imperialist country attacks an oppressed country, where to stand. It's not rocket science. This is a little different. There's objective political problems in this situation. That's what makes it even more difficult. Where you have a big imperialist power trying to push on a great power that's a lesser power. It's more complicated. So it needs more elucidation. So we need, in talking to people, to kind of get ourselves together to try to unravel this. Why we should be against U.S. imperialism. It's not self-evident. The way it is in Syria, the way it is in Libya, the way it is in Iraq and Afghanistan, because Russia's not an oppressed country. If anything, it oppresses people. So this is what our problem is politically. Completely, it's different from the other political problems. It's not simply the backwardness of the movement. It's also, which that's true, but also the complexity of the problem, which is new. So I want to mention that. There's so many questions. I mean, on Syria and the Ukraine, I think this is really true. When I said about General Clark and McCain, both of them mentioned how Obama lost his opportunity in Syria because of the Russians. This is what's going around in the Pentagon and the right wing. The Russians helped Obama get out of attacking Syria. And they are mad about it. They're pissed off. Of course, they also don't want the Russian aid to Syria. They don't want the Russians to foul them up in the Security Council when it comes to sanctions on Iran. And also to give aid to Iran, to break the blockade, or not break the blockade, to diminish the effectiveness of the imperialist blockade. It's a geopolitical struggle between a great reactionary power that's decadent, in the way the Tsarist Russia was in the 19th century, was the great power hovering over Europe and every place, and Marx wanted a war against the Tsar, no matter what. Well, these are the Tsars of the 21st century, is in Wall Street. And that's what we need to focus on. The relationship of forces between the East and the West has changed in favor of the Western imperialists. And by that I include the U.S. And when the relationship of forces between the powers in the East decline and the West gets stronger, they go for it. That's the things that wars are made out of. Big wars. I mean, the first thing that happened was they got Yugoslavia and took it because the relationship of forces changed. They could have never done that in the era of the USSR, ever. But they did it under Yeltsin. So we need to take a look at the situation and see what the forces are that are shaping everything. I think the idea that we need to convey is the idea of the expansionism of imperialism. That it's a law. And that U.S. imperialism has got a lot in common with Nazi imperialism in this way. They are irresistibly driven to expansionism by the development of the means of production and the productive forces which cannot be contained. This is what drove Nazi imperialism and Japanese imperialism. They came late on the imperialist stage, but they were great powers industrially, and they couldn't hold it in. They had to find a way to break out. Now with the U.S., their productive forces are gigantic. And it's strangling them. They can't grow. They all cheer if they will grow 2% or 3%. This is ridiculous. How is a 2% growth or 3% growth going to help us get out of the unemployment problem, the financial problem, all the revenue problems that they have? They're choking on it. They must expand. They're adventurous because of that. Because if they're so mighty industrially, they must. And that leads in the direction of war. And I think that the thing about the Syria and all Russia is they're losing in Syria. They want to go past that, maybe into Russia. They want to get a victory. They want to expand. Look, for 74 years, they contracted imperialism. For 74 years, from 1917 to 1991, they lost Russia with 11 time zones. They lost China with 1/4 of the human race. They lost Cuba, they lost Angola, they lost Ethiopia, they lost so much. Vietnam, Korea, Cambodia, they were being squeezed. And why? Because the USSR was there as a mighty fortress to hold them back from some kind of mad Holocaust adventure against people. Then the USSR fell. And now they want to take it all back. They need to. They want to take all back what they lost. That's why they started with Iraq. And now went to Libya. That's why they want to take Iran. That's why they want to get the DPRK. If they can weaken see, by the way, there's a right wing in Russia. There's a bourgeois right wing that identifies with the forces in the Ukraine who have just been victorious. Don't forget this. You can read the Moscow Times, or you can read in RIA, Novosti news agencies. You can feel the right-wing pressures over there. Now, they've probably been pushed back because of the threat to Russia, but they exist. And if the U.S. imperialists can exert a full-court press, as was said, and exert pressure, it can strengthen the military and the ones who want to fight back, but it can also strengthen the right wing. So their goal is to weaken them inside politically. I don't know if they're ready to have a nuclear war over this, but the goal is to get them from within. That's what the full court press by Reagan was against the USSR, and that's what the full court press now is by the Pentagon against Russia. To corrode them from inside, to germinate the political right-wing forces that want to be with Western imperialism, and to see if they can't cultivate it to the extent of taking over in Russia. That's what they're thinking politically. Now, maybe the Pentagon people want to just blow them away, but that's a long way to go. But they think strategically, politically, geopolitically in relation to Russia, just the way they did with Iraq and Libya and everybody. They want to take it back. And it's not just a subjective desire. The subjective desire is driven by objective internal development of the productive forces. That is bound, can only extend itself through socialism. Only socialism can encompass the productive forces that exist in the USA and allow it to flourish and expand and serve humanity. Only under socialist conditions can the U.S. expand its productive forces and satisfy, create all the commodities, all the use values that people need. So this is the capitalism is strangling itself, and in the struggle to survive, it must expand. The Europeans are weak. They can't have the grandiose vision that the Pentagon has, because they're weak. They live by maneuvers. But the U.S. doesn't live by that alone. They maneuver, but they live by force and violence and expansion and territorial expansion. And the counter-revolution in Ukraine, just don't forget the fact that NGOs have been embedded by the hundreds since the Orange Revolution of 2004. Before that, they cultivated it, they created it. It all comes from the CIA, from Freedom House, from the Republican, I forgot, both parties have their own thing, and plus Soros and everybody else who's in on the act. And they know exactly, they have it down to a science, how to get these demonstrations going, and how to reach the youth, and how to, everything. So they were there in 2003 and 4, they're still there, and they did this. I think it's very important from a Leninist point of view to emphasize that we must not fall into the trap of branding nationalities as this or that. I think that's very important. There's so much of it floating around in the Ukraine crisis. 150,000 Ukrainian partisans fought the Nazis. Let's bring that up. Hey, they're toppling Lenin statues. What are Lenin statues doing there in the first place? I thought the USSR and socialism was overthrown. In Kiev, there's apparently a statue of Lenin. And in Lviv, where they also opened up the arsenals in Lviv, which is what's called the Paris of the Ukraine. It's close to, I think, Poland. What are those statues doing there? You should see the names of the streets. They're named after Bolsheviks all over the Ukraine. So let's not go overboard. When the fascists have the initiative, they do. And they did all those things. But they are not the Ukrainian masses. They are not the working class of the Ukraine. They are fascists who happen to be Ukrainian. And especially by historical development, where Hitler occupied the place. And we could go over, not now, what happened in the Ukraine in the Soviet era. It wasn't all peaches and cream, let me tell you, for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainian kulaks resisted Stalin, and he took forceful measures, but he went overboard. So there's a lot in the Ukrainian history that we need to go over, but not now. Right now, let's concentrate on the enemy, which is U.S. imperialism. This is a joke, but the Israelis have a problem. They really with the fascist elements in the Ukraine. However, the Jewish agency, quietly now, sent aid to the synagogues and the schools, the Jewish schools in Western Ukraine. Security aid, security systems. Hey, what's that about? Talk about contradictions. They know who these people are, and they got to try to find a way to protect their people over there. And if they don't, somebody's going to holler at Netanyahu if he doesn't take care of this. I think that's about it. There's a lot of things to bring up, but that'll do it. But it's true, where their sentiments lie, the ones who took over. Why destroy World War II victory monuments? Who won the war? Who lost? They're mad that the Soviets destroyed the fascists. And they're still pissed off. And they're defacing World War II victory monuments to express their anti-communism and their anti-working class spirit, you know. So anyway, our party's going to be on the right side in this struggle.